Speaking out, Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden makes his first public comments after a former staffer's allegation of sexual assault. Fight for the unborn. Inside the effort to stop Planned Parenthood from being considered a Medicaid provider. The beauty of faith. How a painting depicts the life of St. Joseph the Worker. And the face of Christ. We examine whether images of our Lord can be considered a true image. On EWTN News Nightly for Friday, May 1st, 2020. Good evening, and thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Tracy Sable. To open or not, that is the question tonight facing governors across the country. And today on Twitter, President Donald Trump asked one governor to make a deal. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports.
Today, new White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany held her first formal briefing. It comes as several states try to emerge from their lockdowns.
A new month and a new job for the White House's new press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, who went before reporters this afternoon.
I pray regularly for those who are affected by the coronavirus, but we're going to give confidence to the American people that you have a federal government under President Donald Trump that's going to step up and give the greatest mobilization of the private sector since World War II.
Meanwhile, her boss, President Donald Trump, tweeting out today, the governor of Michigan should give a little and put out the fire. These are very good people, but they are angry. They want their lives back again safely. See them, talk to them, make a deal. In that state, some people are demanding an end to stay-at-home orders which go until May 15th. The governor says that would be turning a blind eye.
We remain in a state of emergency. That is a fact.
Also a fact. More states are opening up, like Colorado and Texas.
We must also come together to begin rebuilding the lives and the livelihoods of our fellow Texans.
And President Trump has made it clear.
I want our country back. I want people to go out and see football games and baseball games and basketball and hockey and golf and all of these sports and not worry about getting sick and violently ill.
But at the same time,
I don't think anybody can feel any worse than I do about all of the death and destruction that's so needless. Nobody. But I also have to make sure that we handle the situation well.
Meanwhile, people helping people. In New York City, taxi drivers are delivering food boxes to families in need.
In New York State, colleges and schools will remain closed through the rest of the academic year. In Louisiana, restaurants are opening with tables 10 feet apart outside. And a suburban St. Louis man just turned 107 years old and survived COVID-19. Tracy?
Well, that is amazing. Thank you so much, Owen. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reporting for us tonight. Joe Biden finally broke his silence this morning. The former vice president is denying a sexual assault allegation made against him by his former Senate staffer, Tara Reade. Biden says it's not true.
I'm saying unequivocally, it never happened. And it didn't. It never happened.
Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales joins us now with this story and more on the allegation. Eric?
Well, Tracy, Joe Biden says if Tara Reade filed a complaint, it would be in the National Archives. He's now asking the Secretary of the Senate to find that complaint and make it public if it exists. But when Biden was pressed about his Senate records at the University of Delaware, Biden says that there's no reason why they should be unsealed. Categorically denying any allegations of sexual assault, Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden says he doesn't remember any complaint made by his former Senate staffer, Tara Reade. But if it exists, it would not be in his confidential papers.
The University of Delaware has no personnel files, but it does have a lot of confidential conversations that I had with the president about a particular issue, that I had with the heads of state of other places, that would not be something that would be revealed while I was in public office or while I was seeking public office.
Last month, Tara Reade described what happened in 1993 with then Senator Biden.
He just had me up against the wall, and the wall was cold. And I remember he It happened all at once. The gym bag, I don't know where it went. I handed it to him, it was gone.
She is just one of 8 women who have made similar allegations against Joe Biden, including Lucy Flores, a former Democratic nominee for lieutenant governor in Nevada, who wrote last year, quote, "I wanted nothing more than to get Biden away from me." And he has been criticized in the past for crossing boundaries with women. His behavior was the focus of a TV segment in February 2015.
Remorse about lady touching is the one thing Joe Biden will not feel.
Republicans point to when Democrats advocated for victims, when the accused was someone like Justice Brett Kavanaugh or President Trump. And they say Democrats are being hypocritical by dismissing Reid's allegation.
Ladies and gentlemen, we just can't have it both ways. We cannot decide which women were included in Believe All Women based on who they are.
The Republican National Committee had some harsh words for Biden's response, calling it a cover-up. They also went to say that the most transparent thing that Biden did this morning was admit that he is hiding documents so that they cannot be used against him. Tracy?
Okay, thank you, Eric. Correspondent Eric Rosales reporting for us tonight. A failure to enforce a lockdown in the Serbian part of Bosnia during Orthodox Easter has apparently caused a spike in COVID-19 cases. At one Orthodox Easter Mass, priests used a shared spoon for communion. Bosnian Serb officials allowed Orthodox churches to celebrate Easter on April 19th. The health minister is urging people to continue practicing social distancing and to wear masks in public, even as quarantine restrictions are eased this week. The leader of Scotland's government is answering critics who say that she did not have enough tests for the coronavirus pandemic.
I can confirm that we now have NHS labs operating in all 14 health board areas. And yesterday we met our target of having the capacity to process 3,500 tests per day. In fact, we exceeded that target.
In her daily briefing today, Scotland's First Minister also said the progress they have made is, quote, really fragile, and it would not take very much to send it into reverse. Scotland has over 11,000 cases of COVID-19. Officials in India have extended the COVID-19 lockdown another 2 weeks in some parts of the country, but other areas will see a relaxation of restrictions, meaning movement of people and economic activity will be allowed. Nearly 1,200 people have died in India from the virus. Coming up, inside the effort to have the Supreme Court consider a case on Planned Parenthood, and an update on the attempts to resume public masses. Indiana helps to lead the charge in asking the Supreme Court to recognize states' authority to disqualify abortion clinics as Medicaid providers. Joining me now on Skype to talk more about this is Thomas Fisher, Solicitor General for the state of Indiana. Welcome to the show. Thanks for being with us.
Oh, thank you for having me, Tracy.
Absolutely. So I know Indiana is co-leading this effort of 19 states. Now, specifically, what are you asking the Supreme Court to consider?
We need the court to take a look at whether abortion providers and other Medicaid providers can sue states when they're disqualified from participating in Medicaid for whatever reason. In our view, the system is set up so that only the federal government can contest state decisions in that regard, and that it's not up to Planned Parenthood or any other abortion provider to come into court to tell the state how it should run its Medicaid program.
Can we talk about a little bit more about the Medicaid Act? You know, how has it been applied to states in the past, and what would you like to see applied here?
Right. So the Medicaid Act is set up as it's a federal grant program, and it tells states you may, if you like, have a program for funding medical services for the poor and disabled. And if you do it according to certain conditions, then the federal government will reimburse you for a certain percentage of your costs. It's not set up as a civil rights statute where it's a mandate to provide certain rights to different individuals. And the idea is supposed to be that if a state conforms to federal conditions, then the federal government pays money. And if not, then the federal government doesn't pay the money. And it's really up to the federal government and the states to work out those details. So what we'd like the court to do here is to take this case and provide clarity on an issue that has divided lower courts, which is whether the Medicaid providers can sue in federal court to tell states how to run their Medicaid programs.
I know in the past that lower courts invalidated an Indiana law that said abortion providers could not be Medicaid providers. The Supreme Court declined to hear that case. So why do this now? And what makes you hopeful that the justices will hear this case?
Right, and we lost that case a while ago, and since then, many courts have weighed in on the same issue. And now, unlike our case, there is a divide in lower court decisions. There was a case out of Louisiana a couple of years ago that we supported, that we had hoped the court would take on this issue, but it fell one vote short, and that was shortly after Justice Kavanaugh took the bench. And we're hoping that this time around, either here or the Chief Justice will be persuaded to take this issue on. We're trying to convince them it's not only about abortion providers, it's about all kinds of Medicaid providers and other federal programs as well. But we think it's a critical issue, and even Justice Thomas last time around wrote a dissent from the denial of the case and said this is an important issue and only this court can resolve what's at stake. And we're hoping that that will carry the day this time, and we'll get that fourth vote to take the case, and ultimately we'll get 5 votes to win.
Now, according to some reports, the general fund spending on Medicaid in the state of Indiana rose nearly 27% from $1.98 billion in 2014 to $2.7 billion in the 2021 budget. Can you tell us, where do abortion providers fit into all of this?
Well, I think the main thing to consider here is not simply that, it's a huge chunk of the Medicaid budget, but what is it that we want to be spending state money on? And our legislature decided that really any tax dollar that goes to an abortion provider, even for services that are not abortions, and even when abortions are not separately billed to Medicaid, that is an indirect support for abortion. And it's really a matter of the state's legislature setting the values and the priorities for its program. And whether it's because we don't want indirect funding for abortion or because providers, whether abortion providers or others, have engaged in misconduct, there are all kinds of reasons for states to decide how providers should be qualified to participate in Medicaid. And that the main thing here is letting states put their programs together as they see fit.
Well, thank you so much for your time and coming on and shedding some light on this. We really appreciate it. Thomas Fisher, Solicitor General for the state of Indiana. Thanks again, Tom.
Thank you, Tracy.
Most of us are entering another weekend without access to public masses, but in a small handful of places around the country, we are seeing a return to liturgy. Correspondent Mark Irons reports. Mark?
Tracy, the Catholic churches that are gradually beginning to reopen their doors tend to be in states that are now reopening for business, places like Montana and Texas. But some diocesan officials say it's just too soon.
Finding a balance between keeping the public safe and providing spiritual needs. It's a challenge the Catholic Church faces.
Suspending Mass was actually a lot easier than figuring out how to resume Mass.
Public masses in the Archdiocese of Denver were supposed to pick back up this week, but Vicar General Father Randy Dolan says suspension will continue until May 8th as a safe plan to return is put in place.
We're trying to make sure that we have some very good guidance that follows what the state is asking us to do.
Meanwhile, in Montana, church doors have reopened with social distance guidelines still in place. In the Diocese of Austin, Texas, a plan to resume public masses on May 5th. The first diocese to return to public masses, Las Cruces, New Mexico.
People that just had a lot of anxiety from being at home.
Christopher Velasquez runs communications for the diocese. He says Bishop Peter Baldacchino had been hearing how COVID-19 was also bringing on isolation, alcoholism, drug abuse, and greater financial concerns. He felt his people needed God more than ever.
One thing that we're doing from our end is Bishop's been very clear since the beginning that if someone is at risk for COVID-19, we are encouraging them to, by all means, please stay at home.
Even with closed churches, a new Pew Research Center survey shows some Americans say their faith has increased as a result of the outbreak. Among a number of religious groups polled, 27% of U.S. Catholic adults say their faith has grown stronger.
The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops tells us that each bishop will need to make the best decisions for their particular diocese. And of course, we continue to see the clergy get creative in administering the sacraments, Tracy, in things like drive-in masses or drive-through confessions. Tracy.
Okay, thank you so much, Mark. Correspondent Mark Irons reporting tonight. And a reminder that you can watch Mass throughout the day right here on EWTN. Mass airs from Irondale, Alabama at 8 a.m., noon, and 7 p.m. Eastern. We also have special programming throughout the day, including the Pope's Mass. Schedules can be found at EWTN.com, and there you can also find Eucharistic adoration throughout the day. Up next, Pope Francis says work is a vocation that comes from God. And the beauty of faith as we honor St. Joseph the Worker. Pope Francis says our daily work is a vocation that comes from God.
È la vocazione prima dell'uomo, lavorare.
At his daily Mass at the Vatican, the Holy Father says our jobs are about creation and dignity. Both reflect the work done by God. Pope Francis also urges the faithful to be united to each other during their endeavors. His remarks come on the feast day of St. Joseph the Worker. And on that feast day, we honor Joseph, the chaste husband of Mary, Jesus' earthly father and patron of all workers, through the beauty of faith. Joining me now on Skype to help us celebrate this day through art is Jem Sullivan, author of The Beauty of Faith. Jem, welcome back to the show. So good to see you.
Thank you, Tracy. It's always good to see you, and thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So St. Joseph has 2 feast days on the liturgical calendar. Can you tell us about the feast day of St. Joseph the Worker?
Sure, you're right, Tracy. You know, St. Joseph has 2 feast days in the church's liturgical year. The first is March 19th, Joseph, husband of Mary. And the second is today's feast, St. Joseph the Worker. And it was Pope Pius XII who in 1955 added this feast to the church's calendar to highlight the Catholic belief in the sacredness of work and the dignity of all workers. There are no spoken words of St. Joseph recorded in the Gospels, but the actions of St. Joseph speak louder than any words he may have spoken. Because God entrusted his son Jesus and his mother Mary to the care and protection of St. Joseph. What a great privilege to be entrusted with that work. And we know St. Joseph responded with great faith in God as he carried out his work. We know St. Joseph was a carpenter, and it was through his manual labor as a carpenter that he provided for Jesus and Mary. But it was also his way of fulfilling his greatest work, which was to be the guardian of the Redeemer of the world.
Jem, can we talk a little bit more about this beautiful painting from the National Gallery of Art? What do we see in it?
Sure. This beautiful 16th century Italian painting is the work of Vittore Carpaccio. He was a painter from Venice, and the Venetian painters loved to paint the natural world. And they often set gospel scenes in these elaborate landscapes. Here, Carpaccio sets the gospel scene of the flight into Egypt against a green landscape with clouds and streams and hills and trees and winding roads. We see Mary clothed in an ornate cloak. She's holding the baby Jesus very close to her as they're seated on a donkey. And St. Joseph, with his staff in hand, is leading them down a dusty road as they flee from Herod, who is wanting to kill the infant Jesus, the newborn Jesus. If Joseph takes another step, he walks right out of the painting. There's this sense of urgency and the sense of movement as we see St. Joseph caring for the Son of God and his mother Mary in this great moment of distress.
Jem, what are some of the lessons that maybe we can take away from St. Joseph and then apply to our daily lives?
You know, Tracy, St. Joseph is the patron saint of work and workers, and he's a powerful intercessor for us during these difficult days of a global pandemic. Those who may be struggling with a sense of anxiety and stress about their work, just struggling with a sense of the value of their work, will find in St. Joseph a model of quiet trust and confident faith in God's providential care. With the work of his hands, St. Joseph provided for the needs of Jesus and Mary, and his example of faith in God gives us a path to follow in these challenging times.
Well, Jem, thank you so much for joining us and sharing this beautiful picture with us. We really appreciate it. Jem Sullivan, author of The Beauty of Faith. Thank you and God bless you.
Thank you, Tracy.
Oh, finally, tonight, we look at the famous veils of Veronica. They show the face of Christ after being used to wipe the face of Jesus when he fell while carrying the cross all the way to Calvary. EWTN Vatican Bureau Chief Alan Holdren has more from Rome.
There are two veils of Veronica in Italy that can help us decipher the true face of Jesus. One veil is kept under lock and key in St. Peter's Basilica. It's shown from the balcony above the statue of St. Veronica once a year on the 5th Sunday of Lent, but is otherwise kept in a chapel within the pillar.
The face of Christ and the devotion to the face of Christ, which comes from the arrival of the Veronica's veil, which leaves the Veronica, the woman who wiped Christ's face on the road to Calvary, and the cloth that has Jesus' face imprinted on it, really begins to circulate in the 1100s. We begin to hear about it, we hear about it, and it's exhibited in St. Peter's as of basically the Middle Ages, so 1100s, 1200s. You begin to see it, this idea of an actual image of Jesus' face.
The second veil is hidden away not far from Rome in Italy's central Abruzzo region. It's always on display behind the altar of the Basilica Shrine of the Holy Face in the little-known town of Manopello. The fine cloth of the veil has no equal. It's made of byssus, also known as sea silk, filaments produced by a certain type of Mediterranean mollusk. The material, just as the image imposed upon it, surprisingly changes before your eyes, depending on the light. Scientists have found no trace of pigment, ink, or paint on the cloth. Christ's face is simply there.
And then to confirm or to assist the image of the face of the Veronica, then we have the face of the Shroud of Turin, which is this negative image in the shroud that contains Jesus' body. And that really goes on a pretty regular display in the 1400s. So we have an image that it turns out that the image that the Christians worked their way towards in the bulk of Christian art is very similar to the image of the man of the shroud and the image of the man of the veil.
The similarity is uncanny. In fact, if one were to place one image on top of the other, they would perfectly coincide. The shroud is highly protected and conserved in a temperature and air-controlled case in Turin's cathedral. Because of its uniqueness and importance, the shroud is only displayed on rare occasions. Rome's Pontifical Regina Apostolorum University has a copy of the shroud on permanent display.
Photo document where the grayscale is inverted so that the photo negative is the positive image. Secondly, the shroud contains three-dimensional information, and so we were able to reproduce a statue of this man, the cadaver as it laid in the tomb, based on information in a two-dimensional cloth. That is unlike any other document in the history of the world. There is no paint anywhere on the shroud. We were looking for that. In 1978, an elite team of scientists came to Italy to study the shroud to answer just this question. What formed the image on the shroud? They found out that there is no paint, no pigment, inorganic or organic, no varnish, no dye, and get this, no directionality, no brush strokes whatsoever. Whatever this is not human artwork.
If science were to prove that the Shroud of Turin wasn't made by human hands, and that the man depicted died in the 1st century in the Holy Land, the question of the first images would be resolved.
In Rome, Alan Holdren, EWTN News Nightly.
An incredible story. Thank you, Alan. And thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. We're back on Monday with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night and God bless.